who I think just knows about everything about the Smith Mine disaster. So you guys are really in for a treat. If you did not get a chance to go downstairs, we will keep the downstairs open for a little bit after, maybe an extra 10, 15 minutes after the program tonight. I do want to let you know that this is a really good opportunity right here, seeing how many people are in the space. We need bigger space to do these. I think it's pretty obvious right now. So if anybody would like to make a donation at the end of the night, we will be taking care of those at the front. We are in desperate need of a boiler so that we can start to heat our second and third floor and start to take care of some of our products that are up on those floors. So we really are happy to have you here. Thank you so much. Without further ado, Jeff.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. How's my volume in the back? Can people hear me? Raising the hand. More. Okay, I'll shout as long as I'm able. To echo what Sarah said, thank you all for coming. It kind of does my heart good to see that so many other people have the same interest in a specific historic event that I have. My name is Jeff McNeish, and how I came by that interest was the fact that as a kid growing up, I'd heard that my great-grandfather was killed in the Smith Mine disaster. And that's about as far as the stories went with the disaster. There were lots of other colorful stories that I can't probably share in this environment, but and I was always curious about what really happened in the Smith Mine disaster. And so about 13, 14 years ago, kind of on a whim, one summer I came down here and just decided to do some research in the archives at the Historical Society, and caught the bug, so to speak. What I ended up finding out was that not only was my great-grandfather killed in the disaster, but so were quite a few other relatives of mine who, when you look at my generation, they're third cousins, second cousins, but you back that up to my grandparents, and those cousins become nephews. So to them it was even more close, I guess is a good word to say for it. And I really kind of came to fall in love with the people that I studied about, not just my family, but all the victims and the survivors as well. Moved a lot by their strength, their stoicism, their ability to weather really a very, very hard time. So what I want to do tonight on the 75th anniversary of the disaster is talk about those people and try to humanize them a little bit. After 75 years, it is difficult to not think of them as just the numbers. 74 died, 3 lived, 114 kids were dependents of the men that died, you know, things like that. We want to try and humanize it a little bit. So that's what I hope to do tonight. Focus on those men and talk a little bit about the effect that the disaster had on the community as a whole. So I'm just going to start here, walking through a little PowerPoint. Early on in my research, I watched a movie called Against the Darkness, a tribute to the Montana coal miner, on sale here at the museum. Awesome, awesome video. It was done when many of the rescue miners and miners in the Bear Creek Valley were still alive, and they're interviewed. It's a living piece of history. So if you ever get a chance, I'd recommend it. But towards the end of the movie, the narrator, Joseph Campanella, said, "He deserves his place in our history, if only to remind us of the dignity of his labor." And that really struck home to me. That's kind of what led to this talk is, you know, let's remember those good people, the dignity that they had, the hard work they did, and remember them as humans, not numbers. One thing that, as I was reflecting, a number of years ago I did many, many talks on the Smith Mine, but it's been 9 years since I've given one. And as I was preparing for this talk, I kind of reflected back on all the people who I had talked to, and those people who are no longer with us. My apologies to Virginia Casey. I believe she is still living in Bear Creek. But I just wanted to take a moment and talk about Betty Waters and Margaret Cameron and Sam Javetti and Bob Wakenshaw, John Maxwell, Pearl DeVille, Linda Planachek, Shirley Piper, Jesse Morich, all people who were there and lived it and were willing to talk to me about it and share with me pictures, stories, and whatnot. So I dedicate the talk tonight to those folks. My relatives that I told you about, I had two granduncles who were killed in the mine, in the Smith mine in the 30s, in separate accidents. Not necessarily, they're not the disaster itself, but the Leslie and Harold Bailey brothers, and then kind of a list of my other relatives that were killed in that disaster. So, again, putting myself in the position of my grandma and grandpa, my grandfather was a rescuer on the disaster. These were all folks that were pretty close relatives to them and who they all knew dearly. So kind of a big hit to my family. And I want to say my family's not unique. There were brothers killed. There were sons and fathers killed in that mine. So this just illustrates more than anything what an impact the disaster had with that many people lost. So again, I'll focus on the people, not necessarily the events. I'll talk about all the known Smith mine victims, 1943 and prior. And we'll talk about who these men were and how their loss affected Carbon County, not just Bear Creek and Red Lodge. So right off the bat, just a show of hands, how many people here have a relative that was lost in the disaster? A pretty good turnout. The thing about the disaster, at least in my family, is it's in your blood. It's part of your family history. You know about it. It's just there. There's no escaping it. And I think that's true for a lot of the families and the descendants of the men who died in that disaster. And I think that's why we have crowds like we do tonight, because it is still such an ingrained part of those families and of the community. Anybody have miners that worked in other mines? Lots of coal miners, descendants here. Anybody here who was present during the disaster? Mr. Webb?
I was. I was there about 2 nights after it happened and seen some cars come out from underneath the highway.
Mr. Webb was about 15.
Yeah, I was 15.
15, came over from Belfry and
some other kids in the car and watched. We just happened to get there when these cars pulled out from underneath the highway. I don't know, it was a day or two afterwards, like 2 days maybe, 1 day, I don't know. And there was one car in the lead, and there's about 4 men in that car, all squatted down, hung on their heads, on their hands, like, and there's quite a few empty cars, but there's tarps over. I don't know whether there's bodies in them or not, I just don't know. So I seen that when I was 15 years old, 1943.
So to kind of repeat, Mr. Webb was 15, drove over with some friends from Belfry.
Yeah.
They had heard that there was a disaster, were checking it out, as teen kids will probably do. And they happened to drive right over the entrance to the Smith mine when there was a spot to park and pull over. And Mr. Webb looked out the car just as some mining cars were coming out of the Smith mine.
That was the main road to Red Lodge at that time, gravel road.
Yep, gravel road to Red Lodge.
Not too many cars on it at that time.
There were 4 men in one of the cars,
But
all with their heads hung down. Like they had just had a not great experience. And some of the cars had tarps over them. He's not sure, but it's possible that they were some of the bodies coming out. So, Mr. Webb, thank you for that.
yeah,
When I did this talk, about nine years ago, we had several other survivors, and now, Mr. Webb, I'm glad you're still here and able to share with us your story.
I think
That's awesome.
it's part of history.
Part of history, absolutely. And here we are 75 years later. When I was doing my research, one of the things that really got me thinking about the effect on the community was an obituary I came across. It's of James Laird, retired coal miner, and he died in Washoe. He was born in 1870 in Scotland. He married a great aunt of mine, great aunt, in 1892 in Scotland. They came over, 1906, hit first the coal mines in Bridger and then on to the coal mines in Washoe, Bear Creek. He had 9 children, or they had 9 children. 2 of them died previous to his death. 6 grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild. So a pretty, nice life. Not remarkable, but definitely a man who had lived a full life. And he was the fire boss in the Washoe mines. The obituary said he died in 1941, 17 months prior to the disaster. Now this is where it gets interesting. 17 months prior to the disaster, keep that in mind. So at his funeral were his son Ned, who was killed in the disaster 17 months later, his son-in-law Clem Lodge, who was also killed 17 months later, his nephew Edward Laird, killed 17 months later, and 5 of his 6 pallbearers were killed 17 months later. And the 1 remaining pallbearer lost his son. So you imagine a simple event such as a funeral, and I can't place any other victims of the 43 disaster at this funeral, but I'm guessing a lot of the Scottish contingent were there. These are a lot of the Scottish guys here, all the pallbearers, all born in Scotland. Except George Thompson, I'm not positive on him. I'd have to look that up. So imagine that, 17 months later, those 9 guys are gone, just from that funeral. So digging into the roots a little bit, the country of birth of the victims of the mine disaster kind of shake out like this. A lot of them born in Scotland, the Yugoslav republics. About 45% of them were first-generation Americans, so they were born in the U.S., but their parents weren't. Some second-generation Americans, and even a third-generation American. So a lot of immigrant influence in the mines, which is not surprising when you hear some stories around Red Lodge and Bear Creek. If you don't go off of country of birth and just go off of, we should say 92% were immigrants or sons of immigrants, so the first generation Americans. The immigrants fueled the Industrial Revolution, and their sons were defending what their fathers built, and Earl Cup called it the greatest generation. Fighting World War II at the time. A lot of the guys who were young enough and working in the mines were really just putting in their time waiting to go fight World War II. The older guys were doing what they could. Just as an aside, the oldest man in the mine disaster was Adam Wakenshaw. He was 72. My great-grandfather was 66. So I can't imagine, I'm 52, and I can't imagine working in a coal mine. So tough people. Looking at just the ethnic heritage, you've got Scots, Slavic republics, Finnish, English, French, Italian, Welsh, Australian, Irish, German, Norwegian, Swedish. Really a mixed bag of miners. I want to talk about these men and their families. Talking about the 75 victims and the 3 survivors. Now, a lot of stuff you'll read says there's 74 victims, but there was one rescuer that died, and I saw him referred to as the 75th victim, and I kind of believe that. He was one of the first guys into the mine when the disaster happened. He obviously got a good dose of some not good gas, and not long after died. And that was Matt Woodrow was his name. Of these people, 10 were bachelors, 5 were widowers. They had 176 children, including stepchildren and children deceased before the miner's death. And of those 176, 114 were still dependents. So a lot of kids lost their dad that day. And a lot of wives lost their husband. Before we get into the accident, we'll just talk about the pre-43 known victims. And I'm sure that I haven't found all of them. That was a mine that just kind of chewed people up. And as all coal mines of that era did, it was not a safe working environment, to say the least. But one of them was a bachelor. They had 8 children and 11 dependents. So there's 11 children and wives who lost a husband. They get referred to as brothers underground, but they were also brothers above ground in more ways than one. Small community. Everybody knows everybody. And so what I tried to do is put together family trees that more are marriage-based, call them community family trees, and see how many people does it take to connect all these victims together, to give us an idea of just how tight-knit the community was. And the first grouping I found was the Anderson grouping. Emil Anderson, Louis DeRille, and John Kropp were all related by about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 people through marriage, birth, natural or non-genetic connections. The Cunningham group, Art Halpin, Bob McDonald, and Bill Pello, they were all connected through marriage and genetically by 2, 4, 6, 8 or 7. Cenas grouping, Marcel Phages and Bill Noble, connected by marriage of their children. And then I believe, but I can't prove, that we can connect Ignacy Marinchik, Martin Ratkovich, John Sudar via the Ratkovich family. Now the McDonald grouping, which my great-grandfather is a part of, can group 34 of the victims, 3 pre-1943, 29 in the 1943 disaster, and 2 survivors of the 1943 disaster. And that looks something like this. But the key thing to think about here is there's about 100 people in this diagram, and 34 of them died that day. So imagine we've got a group of about probably 120 here. Imagine if we picked 34 and you were just, they were gone. So it kind of illustrates it doesn't take a lot of people to connect those 34 men in the community. And that excludes just friendships and neighbors and whatnot. So you can imagine what that day was like for the survivors. And these are the 34 men in that grouping. The next thing I was curious about was I had never read where in the mine my great-grandfather was found, or even what he was doing, or what crew he was working with. Who were the guys that he was working with? So I got curious about that, and I tried my best. I wasn't 100% successful, but to identify where in the mine each guy was found, where he was working, and what team he was working with. I thought that would be interesting. So kind of what I came up with is this is a real rough look at what the mine looks like tunnel-wise when these guys were working. One guy was found here, one here working alone, two there, and that was all on the second seam. I'll stop for a second and describe. They were mining at the time of the disaster in 2 seams of coal from the surface. If you count it from the top down, they were mining the second one from the surface and the third one from the surface. The second one from the surface had pretty much been mined out by the time of the disaster. And so a good decade before the disaster, they had driven a slope from those workings down into the number 3 seam, and that's where they were mining when the disaster happened. So those men that I just described there were all working on the number 2 seam, so they were closest to the entrance. 3 of them survived, 3 didn't. The 3 survivors all had to be resuscitated, but they did survive. And included in there is on the surface, Matt Woodrow. He's the 65th victim. He was working above ground as a mechanic, and again was one of the first guys in there to try and help rescue people. 2 guys were working together, Dewey Hardy and Alec Hawthorne. See the difference in age there, 73. Hawthorne might have been the oldest. I think I said something wrong earlier. I apologize. And then Dewey Hardy, 44, kind of in that mid-range. Their job was to haul coal cars, or arranged to haul coal cars from the number 3 seam up to the number 2 and then out to the buildings to be processed. Alec lived, Dewey Hardy didn't. Alec was able, real briefly, to make a call to the surface saying something's wrong down here, and then he passed out because of lack of oxygen and exposure to the noxious gases. They found him slumped over a railing by the phone. There was a track layer who was further down the line working by himself. This is kind of a sad story. He was obviously making his way out of the mine, and he was at a doorway that would lead him into a separate shaft that was pushing fresh air into the mine by a surface fan. He didn't get that door open before he passed out. He was found slumped against it. So he literally was the width of a door. away from possibly being the fourth survivor. Eli Houtinen and Willard Reed, they were in charge or working on pumping water out of the mine to the surface. They both survived. They were both able to be resuscitated. Now this is a map of the number 3 seam, the one where most of the men were working when the disaster hit. It's a crude map. It just shows kind of the main passageways that it gets the point across. 4 guys were found here, a team of 4, a team of 6 here, a team of 5 here, 1 guy by himself here. 2 separate teams were working in this tunnel, one of 9 men and one of 5. 3 guys were working here at the farthest reach of the mine. That point's about 2 miles from the entrance. So, oh, I'm sorry. So obviously no running out of the mine or running away from the explosion. They were in there a ways. Working up the other side of the mine, there was 1 man working alone here, 2 working here, 1 working here, 1 here, 12 working in this tunnel. Another 1 here, 10 here. It's a pretty big group of men, with 1 by himself. 2 there. That was the location of an underground repair shop. Again, if you're 2 miles from the surface and you have something break down, it's a lot easier to fix it underground than to haul it to the surface. So they would try and effect a lot of repairs there. 7 guys here, 1 found here. And just talking about the crews, what I kind of like to look at was I was looking at, did they group crews by ethnic heritage? You know, did all the Scots like to work together, or the Slavs like to work together? Here's a real mixed crew here. Italian, 2nd generation American, Finnish, and French. The interesting thing here is you have a Pete Givetti who was working a motor that was hauling coal cars out of the mine. And working with him was Wilbur Muller, a nipper. And you look at their differences in age. Pete was probably one of the guys that was kept around as an essential miner and not in the war. And Wilbur was probably hanging around waiting to get drafted at that age. Wilbur was one of the younger guys to die. And then again here you have Bill Pello working with Herman Meejan, who was the youngest. Again, they're kind of pairing an older, more experienced guy with a younger kid, really, so to speak. There was a loading crew in the 5 West tunnel. Again, a real mixture of ethnicities. So they truly were brothers underground. They didn't stick together by their history in the old country. They just worked on the teams they worked on and got to know each other. And again, pretty wide range of ages and ethnicities. This crew was a mining crew. They were actually digging into the base of a tunnel, getting the coal mined out. Mostly Scots with Norwegian and English in there. My great-grandfather, Adam Wakenshaw. Again, not really young men on this crew, but experienced, and that's probably why they were working the mining machines. Dick Mallon was a timberman, 68, and he's putting timbers up in a coal mine. He was working alone. And he was at the far end of the tunnel he was working in when the explosion hit. And they know that because they found his equipment there, including his glasses, which didn't really matter because it was pitch black after the disaster. It had blown out all the electricity. He had been burned, but they found his body about 600 feet from where they found his gear. So he had made it in the pitch black, burned from the explosion, without any gear, 600 feet towards the surface before the noxious gas got to him. There was a loading crew in the 8 West parting. Again, you just notice the ethnic mix. You know, these guys were teammates. They weren't sticking together by all the Scots or what have you. And again, a real wide range of ages. Two mining crews were working in this entry, and I think about half of them were burned and half died from the gas. At the far face, that 2 miles in, those 3 guys I pointed out, they were the drillers and the shooters, and one laborer kind of off away from them. And a real mix there again. Bill Noble, 68, not a young guy to be in the mine. I don't know who, but in this area of the mine near the 11th Southeast parting, there was a track layer found. I haven't been able to put the pieces together to know his name. Track layer and a timberman working together in this area of the mine. This area was hit hard by the explosion. Ed Laird was about 30 feet from the end of the entry. The explosion blew him out of his clothes to the ceiling and along the ceiling to the face of the mine where the shaft he was in. So kind of gives you a little bit of an indication of just how powerful the blast was underground. Dave Murray was alone. He was a foreman and also a fire boss. So likely he was checking out where work would be the next day, looking for gas, making sure it was safe. That was his job. If he did find gas, his job was to either clear it out or decide that they would work somewhere else the next day. A loading crew over here, mostly Scots. That was probably by accident, I don't know. Dave and John Somerville, father and son. In the same entry were a few other guys, I think 11 altogether. And they were not affected by the explosion and were walking out. I think probably they were so far away from where the explosion happened, they may not have heard it. They just knew the lights went out, and when the lights go out, you walk to the main haulageway and wait for somebody to come get you. So they were, a group of 11 of them were found sitting where the gas had finally gotten to them. Young Dave Somerville's lap was, or head was in the lap of his father when they found him. So they don't know if he slumped over as he succumbed to the gas or was laying in his dad's lap when it got him. So another mixed group of ethnicities here working as a loading crew, along with 7 additional men who I haven't been able to identify and place them exactly here. Another fire boss found alone, Jack Micklejohn. Again, he was probably off doing what he did, checking for gas and checking for where they were going to mine the next day. And then a big group of men in this entry who were either loading or track crews in several different areas. I could put them on this side of the mine, I just can't say for sure where they were. And then in the shop was Frank Morich and Bill DeBerg, electrician and machine repair. In the 5 Southeast parting were this group of men, a loading crew. The guys with asterisks are the ones that had the wherewithal to know what was happening or what was coming their way. Sat down, had a piece of chalk, wrote some notes to their wives and children on the scraps of boards they could find, and actually tried to build a barricade to keep the bad gas out and the good gas in. They weren't successful. I think they knew that was the case. They weren't going to be successful because one of the notes said we tried our best, but we couldn't get out. One of their notes to their families. And then Elmer Price, again, a foreman, found alone, probably scoping out the mine for the next day's work. It took them, he was the last man found, and it took them 2 or 3 times through where he was eventually found to spot him. I don't know why, but it took that many days. These guys were community leaders. Jules Basink was a former mayor. Pete Givetti and Frank Morich were on the Bear Creek City Council. Frank was also on the school board. Obviously, United Mine Workers officials here, the president, vice president, the pit committee member, and then some interesting tidbits. Bud Wakenshaw and his father-in-law, Frank Sumacek, played Santa at the Union Christmas gatherings each year. You know, just to kind of humanize these guys a little bit. The guy that played Santa was just killed. Selective Service Board Chairman was John Bone. Bill Shepard was on the War Savings Committee. Bill Noble was a Justice of the Peace, and Bud Wakenshaw a constable. So you can kind of see the community infrastructure here also took a big hit, not just the family infrastructure. They belonged to fraternal organizations, John Kropp, Slovenian National Benefit Society, Joe Meyer, president of the American Fraternal Union, and they were community builders as well. Pete Givetti helped build the swimming pool in Bear Creek for the kids. Frank Morich brought electricity to Scotch Coulee in 1919. Remember, he was the head electrician in the mine, so that makes sense. Bud Wakenshaw helped build Cooney Dam and the Beartooth Highway. Matt Ridrow, the 75th victim, built a hotel in Red Lodge, later called Harley's Cottages. And all these guys probably helped build each other's homes. One of the most interesting things I read about, or read in my studies, was that if somebody needed a house built, all they needed was a keg of beer and a Saturday. And everybody would show up, and the keg of beer would get drunk, and the house would get built. And it was true. These guys were very handy, and they built their own homes. You know, and they weren't uneducated men. They may not have gotten the educational opportunities that a lot of them did, but Bus Hawthorne went to the Billings Business College. John Hodnick was a Billings Business College graduate. Wilbur Moeller went out to Chicago's KB Electrical School. Sam Barovich, who was a very interesting dude, spoke 5 languages. And he fought in 3 wars. World War I and the First and Second Balkan Wars. You know, and it took a coal mine in Montana to take him out. Veterans, as I mentioned, Bill Appleton, Sam Barovich, Bill DeBoer, John Madden, Bill Pello, Bob Whitehead, Bid Zapital, all World War I vets. So they fought in World War I, and some 25, 30 years later, here they are in a coal mine. They weren't spring chickens, any of these guys. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about some decimated families and put some faces to it, using my own family. The little girl in this picture is my grandmother McNeish, my dad Jack's mother. This is her family. Her youngest sister has not yet been born. They had one other girl after this picture was taken. But Harold, my great uncle, was injured in 43 in the mine and finally died of those injuries in 34, and finally died of those injuries in 36. Leslie was killed outright in 37 in the Smith mine. And my great aunt Alice was married to Harold Graves, who was the fire chief at the time of the disaster here in Red Lodge. He was one of the earlier guys into the mine as well. And he died a few years later of a heart attack at a very young age. And I'm speculating, I can't prove this, but I believe the exposure to the gas had something to do with that. One of the things carbon dioxide does is attacks muscles, especially the heart. And he was hunting and he sat down on a bench in a cabin and said, I guess this is what a heart attack feels like. And he was gone. So, my grandmother essentially lost, not essentially, she did lose 2 brothers and a brother-in-law. Pretty big impact. And there she is. Along with that, she lost her father-in-law and 7 other relatives in the disaster. This is the John and Mary Cameron McDonald family. The little girl right here is my great-grandmother, the wife of my great-grandfather who died in the mine. Her brother Abe was a mine victim in the 43 disaster. Her brother Dan, who was the lone surviving pallbearer that we talked about earlier, James Laird, passed away had her son lost in the 43 disaster. Her sister's husband, her brother-in-law, was killed in the disaster, as was her son. So Jean lost a husband and a son in that disaster. And my great-grandma, Euphemia, they called her Fame, lost her husband in the 43 disaster. And even looking more into the communities, Bear Creek was around 450 population at the time of the disaster. It was between censuses, so I can't be certain. But 38 of the victims lived in that community, and 10 had recently moved to Red Lodge. So 11% of the population was killed in one event. Looking at the 1930 census, Bear Creek had 213 heads of household. 23 heads of household were 1943 victims. 2 heads of household were killed in the 30s. And 1 man living as a boarder in 1930 was a 43 victim. 6 children were living at home of the 43 victims. And 1 head of household was a 43 survivor. So again, you see about that 10-11% ratio. You go down to a lower level, you look at 4th Street, and there were 11 homes on 4th Street. 2 homes lost their head of household, Bill Noble and Dave Murray. Bus Hawthorne was still living at home but was killed in the disaster. And Alec Hawthorne was killed in the disaster. He survived the disaster, I'm sorry. So, think of your block on your street 11 homes, this many guys missing. 5th Street had 12 families living on it. 4 heads of household were victims. Washoe had 189 heads of household. 17 were victims, 1 survived. Again, about 10%. So that's kind of a look at the guys and how their loss had to have been felt by everybody. I really got a good sense from my research of just how strong a people these folks were. They were humans, you know. Some were hard drinkers, some of them were fighters. There were a lot of those, but you know, they were good people and they worked hard. And the hole that their loss left in their families, in their family groupings, and in their community was kind of unimaginable. I still am a little bit in awe of the survivors and how they were able to forge on and, you know, continue living their lives. It just, especially the kids, you know, that's pretty amazing that the kids had the wherewithal to make it through. So I'll kind of close with that, and I'll just open the floor to questions if anybody has any questions.
I do.
Oh, Mr. Webb.
A lot of those workers that were up in age were working on account of World War II.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there was, because there wasn't many young men left
Yep.
to work. I know on the farms over there, I was 15 years old and I worked twice for crews and everything else, stayed out of school, and our dads worked, but they older men like 50, 60, 70 was out there working too. There was no one in between working at that time.
Yeah, there was no retirement during World War II.
Well, no, there wasn't. So a lot of those miners might have not been working if the World War II hadn't been.
Absolutely. Bill.
I can't remember her name, but she wrote a book on the Bear Creek disaster. And in that book, as I remember right, she talked about how the parent company kind of delayed getting another ventilating shaft built and installed, like often happens.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read that particular part of that book, a week later in West Virginia, the same thing happened. They delayed in getting the ventilation system up to date, and they lost 29.
Yeah.
So history just keeps repeating itself.
Yeah, history does have a way of repeating itself. Yeah.
I was just going to say that my grandfather worked in a Smith mine, and he had just switched shifts with somebody, and he just got home from his shift when the alarms and everything went off. So, and then he had to help recover the bodies for, 2-3 days. So,
Yeah.
it was really, hard for him.
It took 9 days before they got the last guy out.
Yeah.
He was one of the.
Yeah, I said God was looking out for him that day because that was his shift. My mom was like about 5 or so, and she can still remember the sirens and everything going on.
Oh yeah, it gets in the family's blood. It really does.
How did the widows survive?
You know, a lot of them went to work for the first time in their lives. And I say that, I want to couch that comment with, many of them were raising, large families, so it's not like they weren't working before, but they had to go out and earn money, and that's what they did.
Well, where could they get jobs?
A lot of them moved away. A lot of them remarried. They would take jobs as clerks. I don't know if anybody here has a story of a relative whose husband died and what they might have done, but yeah, there wasn't kind of the social safety net, or it was very small at the time, and so they didn't get like any big Social Security payout or life insurance or or anything like that. It was, they had to go to work. They had to support those kids, and I think a lot of the kids pitched in and really helped too. So, Galen.
God, they opened the mine up again, didn't they?
They did. The disaster happened in late February. They had opened a new entrance into the second seam of coal by June, and were producing coal. World War II was on. They needed the coal, and the drive was on. And finally, the owners of the Smith mine, who had the Foster mine as well, they finally closed down around 52, 53, I believe, and that was kind of the end of. There were some mines that continued on in the Bear Creek Valley. The Brophy mine, I think, closed in '67, and the Janskoviches, two brothers, started out free, had a little family mine that closed down in the '70s.
In your job descriptions, you had nipper.
Yeah.
What was that?
Well, all of the vehicles underground were electric vehicles. Wasn't too healthy to have a combustion engine underground, you know, when you're having trouble with methane and bad air anyway. But they were like cable cars. And so the nipper's job was to move the electrical attachment as they moved through the mines from one electrified cable to the next. And from what I've heard, it was not a fun job. I think it was Dick DeVille telling me at lunch that his dad had told him you could always tell a nipper because he was missing a finger or two. When
What was the weather? Wasn't it, there was no snow, am I correct?
the day of the disaster was unseasonably warm. It was a Saturday. It was also a payday, and it was a time and a half day, which the miners were all pretty happy about. They were making good money. So the crew that the mine blew up on had gone to work about 8 or so, and the mine blew about 9. So there were quite a few women picking up paychecks already at the mine that day, and were there. And then, of course, more family members came as word spread. But that nice warm February day on a Saturday turned pretty cold pretty fast, and was just kind of ugly, typical Montana weather for the rest of the rescue and recovery. And even into the burials, there were as many as 9 burials a day once they finally got everybody out. Digging those graves in the frozen ground wasn't a real easy task, especially that many of them. So. Oh, yes.
What caused the first explosion? What caused the explosion? Where did it
You know, about what everybody can agree on, and by everybody I mean the entities that were present at the time of the disaster and testified at the coroner's inquest, was that it was likely a small methane explosion that threw coal dust up into the air and ignited that coal dust, and the coal dust explosion just ran through the mine. Where that methane explosion was a bone of contention during the coroner's inquest. Everybody had a theory, and the theory was always one that left them blameless as to why it happened there. I've got a whole nother talk that goes about 2 hours just on that. It's interesting, but in the end, we'll never know. I do think they were right. There was a small methane explosion, and it was the coal dust that did the most damage.
Do you know the name of the man who the book is about that he read, I think? Who wrote the lady that wrote the book called it What He Wrote on the Wall, which was Goodbye Wives and Daughters. Do you know his name?
Not off the top of my head, but there is downstairs in the mine exhibit. It will tell you. I want to say it was Emil Anderson, but
No.
it wasn't.
He was the one that wrote Agnes.
Oh, that's correct.
I could hear him.
It wasn't Emil. It wasn't Emil.
It was
I read the book, but I
Oh,
forgot.
pardon me?
It was Walter Joki.
Walter Joki.
Okay, thank you.
We have another Smith mine expert in the audience. I'll pick on you a little bit and say she's writing a large paper on the Smith mine disaster for college. So, thank you. Oh, yes.
Did the mining company pay out any money to the families of the victims?
They did not that I know of. The miners' union paid the widows some money. They got a pretty small stipend from some kind of federal program, and that was really about it.
Where are most of them buried?
You know, between Bear Creek and Red Lodge, there's 2 or 3 down in Billings, and I can't remember. I think there's some odd ones in different cemeteries around the county.
Doesn't Bear Creek have a memorial with all their names on
It does, and,
Yes.
and Red Lodge as well.
it? Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Actually, it doesn't. It doesn't have all the names on it.
Not all?
There are a number of Slavic individuals who died, and their gravestones are in Cyrillic. And nobody was able to translate them. So next to the name, it just says, not available. Nobody knows.
Interesting.
Who.
And that's one thing, you know, mentioning the Bear Creek Cemetery. If you want to see a neat piece of history, go there in the spring before the rattlesnakes come out. but look at those headstones with the Cyrillic writing, because they are amazing. And just not too long ago, that cemetery was also actually placed on the National Registry of Historic Places, I believe. Is that correct, Deb?
Yep.
So that cemetery, as well as the mine site of the Smith mine disaster, is on the National Registry of Historic Places.
I was just going to answer the one about what did women do. I can only speak for my mom. She had a 13-year-old daughter at the time. And she moved from Washoe to Red Lodge and got a clerking job at the Red Lodge drugstore. And what is now the Yoga Motel used to be apartment house. And they were able to rent one of the rooms downstairs apartments. And I think a number of the women came over to Red Lodge because she remained friends with a whole lot of those names that I recognize. So I don't know if they also found work here or they decided to have with that. Jeff, the lady that was just speaking is Kate Palmer, and she's Grace Spalding's sister.
Oh, nice to meet you. Yes, sir.
The number of people who died in the disaster made up what percentage of the total Smith mine workforce?
I've not been able to find that number, but I'm guessing half. They were running a essentially 2 crews, but really 3, 2 fully manned crews, a day shift, a night shift, and then there was kind of a graveyard shift in between of just a few men who just kind of did some tidying up around the mine in preparation for the next shift. So they were working around the clock. My best guess is about half. All right, well, I want to thank you all so much for coming out on a weeknight and hear me speak about my obsession, so to speak. I very much appreciate the questions too. I learn a lot when I do these talks. I run into people like Mr. Webb, who was there and can tell me and fill me in on what was going on. I learn a lot about what the wives did through those questions, and so I thank you all for coming. I hope you continue to come to events here at the museum. Carbon County has some awesome history in it, and I hope you continue to support it, and I may be back with another Smith Mine talk, you don't know. So, thank you.